It was a night as black as ink, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole, leaving only the eerie glow of the headlights cutting through the void. I'd been driving for what felt like an eternity, the monotonous hum of the engine my only company on the deserted highway. My eyes were growing heavy, blurring the white lines into a single streak. I could almost feel the weight of the solitude pressing down on me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure by the side of the road. A hitchhiker alone in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down, rolling to a stop next to him. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows of a low-brimmed hat. His clothes were dusty and worn like he'd been on the road for a while. He thanked me, his voice a rough whisper carried away by the wind. We drove in an uncomfortable silence. He stared out of the window, his reflection a distorted ghost dancing in the glass. I tried to make conversation, but he only grunted in response. There was something about him that set my teeth on edge, an unease that crawled under my skin. But I shrugged it off, blaming it on the late hour and the miles of empty road behind us. Then he asked me to pull over. I was puzzled, but I obliged. He stepped out of the car, disappearing into the darkness. I waited, the silence suddenly too loud in my ears. After what felt like hours, he returned, his clothes darker, his hands wet. He said he had been sick. I didn't believe him. Back on the road, the tension was palpable, a living thing curling between us. I glanced at him, his face illuminated by the passing lights. His eyes were cold, detached. He was humming a tune under his breath. A song I'd heard before. A song played on the news, associated with a serial killer who'd been leaving a trail of bodies along the highway. My heart pounded in my chest, my blood roaring in my ears. I was trapped in a car with a killer. I needed a plan. I saw a rest stop sign approaching and told him I needed a bathroom break. He nodded, his gaze never leaving the road. I parked the car, fumbling with the keys. I stepped out, my legs shaking. I told him I'd be right back, praying he wouldn't follow. I rushed into the rest stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I dialed 911, my fingers slipping on the screen. I explained the situation in hushed whispers. They told me to stay where I was, that help was on the way. I hid in the shadows, watching the car. He was still inside, waiting. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come looking for me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights approaching. I watched as they surrounded the car, their guns drawn. He stepped out, his hands raised. As they cuffed him, he turned to look at me, his eyes burning with something I couldn't comprehend. He winked, a twisted smile playing on his lips. The relief washed over me, leaving me shaking. I'd come so close, closer than I ever want to be again. Driving alone at night will never be the same. The open road isn't a symbol of freedom anymore. It's a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the reach of the headlights, of the danger that can appear out of nowhere. The kindness for a stranger isn't always harmless. Sometimes it might just save your life, or in my case, almost cost it. It was a night darker than the deepest abyss, with the moon hiding behind the thick foreboding clouds. I found myself driving through a desolate countryside where civilization seemed to have abandoned its claim. The only source of illumination was the feeble glow from my car's headlights, slicing through the dense, eerie silence. The chilling wind howled, its haunting melody echoing through the skeletal trees lining the narrow, winding road. Their skeletal arms reached out as if pleading for salvation, their shadows twisting and morphing on the asphalt, creating monstrous forms that danced in the night. The decrepit road was a serpent, its scaly back undulating through the bleak landscape, a grotesque welcoming party to the heart of desolation. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the cold leather biting into my skin. I could sense a creeping dread, a sinister presence that seemed to lurk just beyond the edges of my vision. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the late hour and the isolation. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I squinted, peering into the impenetrable darkness. There in the distance, a figure stood by the roadside. As I drew closer, the faint glow of the headlights revealed a woman, her pale face a stark contrast to the inky darkness. Her eyes seemed hollow, lost, and her clothes were torn and dirty. She stretched out a hand, her fingers trembling in the icy wind, a silent plea for help. An unsettling chill ran down my spine, but as a human, I couldn't just ignore her, could I? Maybe she was in trouble. I slowed down, rolling down the window. I was hit by a gust of wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul, the smell of decay. Suppressing a gag, I turned to the woman. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the relentless wind. Slowly she nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. I unlocked the door, letting her inside. I noticed her feet were bare, caked in mud and blood. A shiver ran down my spine. As I continued my journey, I could feel her eyes burning holes into the side of my head. The silence in the car was deafening, the air thick with unease. I tried to make small talk, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the endless road ahead. Suddenly, an inhuman shriek tore through the night, the sound echoing in my ears. I swerved, narrowly avoiding a dark figure that had appeared in the middle of the road. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to regain control of the car. When I turned to look at the woman, I found her seat empty. My blood ran cold. Where had she gone? Suddenly, a sickening sense of dread washed over me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her, her eyes now glowing an unnatural red, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Her pale skin had turned a sickening shade of gray, and her hands morphed into gnarled claws. She lunged at me, her scream piercing the silence. I swerved, my eyes fixed on the nightmare in the back seat. The car spun out of control, the world around me becoming a blur of darkness and terror. Then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the desolate road. My car was in a ditch, the windshield shattered, but the back seat was empty. The woman was gone. I don't know if what happened that night was real or a figment of my imagination, but one thing is for sure, I will never forget that drive, that night of terror. I will always remember the woman with the red eyes and her chilling, inhuman scream. That night, the darkness came alive, and I was its prey. The night was as dark as a raven's feather, the moon hiding behind an army of thick, ominous clouds. The only light came from the sickly yellow beams of my car's headlights, which barely illuminated the lonely stretch of road ahead. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to swallow the light, its impenetrable darkness looming over me like a predator ready to pounce. The wind howled like a tortured ghost, violently shaking the skeletal branches of the ancient trees. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the death grip I had on it. The eerie silence inside the car was only broken by the rhythmic thump of my heart echoing in my ears and the soft whisper of the car's engine, which seemed to be holding its breath just like me. Suddenly, the car's radio, which had been silent until now, crackled to life. A static-filled voice, barely more than a whisper, began to speak in a language I couldn't recognize. It was a chilling, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate in the car and in my bones. I fumbled for the radio's knob, turning it off with a shaky hand, but the voice continued to whisper, growing louder and more insistent. Terror gripped me like an icy hand around my throat. The road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, the darkness closing in on all sides. The car's headlights flickered once, twice, before dying out completely. I was plunged into absolute darkness. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears. In the darkness, I could see vague shapes shifting and moving. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but they remained, growing larger and more terrifying with each passing second. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, scraping against the sides of the car with an awful screeching noise that made my skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I screamed, slamming the brakes, but the car skidded on the wet asphalt, spinning out of control. The figure remained unmoving, a dark silhouette against the pitch-black night. It was tall, impossibly so, its form skeletal and twisted, with long, spindly limbs that stretched out in all directions. As my car skidded to a halt, inches away from the figure, my headlights flickered back on. The light hit the figure, casting long, monstrous shadows on the road. It had no face, just a blank, featureless void where its face should have been. It turned slowly towards me, an unnatural, jerky movement that sent icy chills down my spine. I was frozen in place, my breath hitching in my throat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The figure reached out towards me. Its fingers were long and skeletal, ending in sharp black claws. It tapped on the windshield, a soft rhythmic tap-tap-tap that echoed in the silent night. Suddenly, the car's engine roared to life, and the figure vanished as if it had never existed. The world around me returned to its normal, albeit dark and eerie state. I blinked, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the light, or something far more sinister lurking in the darkness? I didn't wait to find out. With a swift push, I floored the accelerator, leaving the nightmare behind. As the car sped down the lonely road, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, save for the dark, looming trees, and the faint, fading silhouette of the faceless figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away into the night. Thank you for listening to these 3 stories. I encourage you to check out other equally terrifying stories on my channel. I will be glad if you leave a like and subscribe. I'm just getting started. I'd love your comments and feedback. Have a nice nightmare, dearest. We hear each other soon.